Good evening, everybody. I'd like to apologize for the slight delay in getting things going this evening and to welcome you to another lecture in our PFWS series. And thank you for joining us this evening. I'd also like to apologize on behalf of Her Excellency Marie-Louise Colero-Preca, who regrets that she can't be here this evening as she's expected at credentials, but she augurs a fruitful lecture and discussion, and very much wish that she could be here. And she also wanted me to relay how happy she was to be at George Mason University last year in September and to see the fantastic work being done over there, and that she looks forward to continuing this fruitful collaboration between the foundation and George Mason University, excuse me. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Susanne Hirsch. Professor Susanne Hirsch is a professor in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University in the United States, where she specializes in legal anthropology, based on ethnographic research conducted in Kenya, Tanzania, and the United States. Her publications focus on law as a response to conflicts that range from terrorism and atrocity to social issues, example, environment or domestic violence, to interpersonal relationships. Among her several books is In the Moment of Greatest Calamity, Terrorism, Grief, and a Victim's Quest for Justice, which is based on her experiences surviving a terror attack. Hirsch's latest research examines family law, religious diversity, and rule of law in Malta and several other nations. She is currently a Fulbright lecturer in the law faculty of the University of Malta, where she is also affiliated with Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies. So I introduce Professor Hirsch for her lecture today, The Call for Rule of Law, a Feminist Approach to Peace and Social Inclusion Through Justice.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I greatly admire Her Excellency and really thank her for her kind words. And I admire the work of the President's Foundation for the Well-Being of Society. I've really had a great opportunity to work on a number of different projects with the President's Foundation, and especially I appreciate the friendship of Sharon and of Dr. Ruth Ferrugia. Finally, it's especially wonderful to have my husband, Michael Sullivan, with me here tonight, and my students from George Mason's joint program with the University of Malta, where students are studying conflict resolution at the master's level. And I want to thank everyone else for coming. Move this just a bit. In early November 2017, dozens of wealthy and powerful Saudi men, some of them members of the Saudi royal family, were picked up by police and taken to a 5-star hotel in Riyadh. They were forced to exchange their clothes for uniforms. Forbidden from leaving the hotel, they could order room service and watch TV. Soon, interrogators accused them of corrupt business practices and of financial crimes. As one Western diplomat put it, quote, "There was no due process of any sort. No courts, no judges, no warrants, none of that," end quote. The only option for each was to pay a large amount of money in exchange for their liberty. We see in this example two contradictory sides of the rule of law. First, it illustrates that rule of law in its simplest form, no one, even the powerful, is above the law. The fact that these privileged men are no longer permitted to enrich themselves illegally is evidence of rule of law in action. Yet, counter to the rule of law, once accused of crimes, they were subjected to highly irregular and ad hoc procedures. They were denied protections that rule of law promises to criminal suspects. Much as we might look with scorn on powerful abusers of public trust, In our hearts, or maybe in our stomachs, there's a sick feeling when we see people stripped of their rights and vulnerable to the power of the state. Who doesn't feel the specter of proclaiming one's innocence from the bottom of a well or the back of a dungeon? Rule of law, with its direct lineage to the Magna Carta and the concept of habeas corpus, charts the road to justice by restraining the power of the state. I've been studying rule of law in various ways since 2007, but lately I've been stunned at the attention that this concept is receiving in my own country and in other places where I spend time, here in Malta and also in East Africa. Just yesterday, the Times of Malta carried a piece by Martin Scicluna titled "Malta's Rule of Law." On a daily basis in the United States, the press secretary for the president is asked by journalists, "Does the president believe he's above the law?" And this has happened multiple times. Difficult question for the press secretary to answer. The call for rule of law is on the lips of activists seeking access to justice and citizens demanding political accountability. What does it mean to call for rule of law? In stable democracies, the call for rule of law is usually a warning about an extreme situation. It expresses deep concern and pleads for something to be done. The call for rule of law implies injustice, but it also goes further to warn of an instability that society ignores at its peril. Tonight, I'll begin by defining rule of law and describing efforts to promote and measure it globally. Although I raised some concerns about some of these rule of law initiatives, I'm too pragmatic to turn away from the concept. And also I'm too concerned about its opposite, the capricious rule of man, which is unpredictable and potentially dictatorial. The need for rule of law is clear when we consider situations of violent conflict. Tonight, I'll tell the story of Kenya in 2007, when rule of law collapsed and was then revived through a conscious effort that strengthened the nation through strengthening rule of law. Finally, coming back closer to home later in my talk, I propose that we treat the call for rule of law, especially in our own nations, as an opportunity to imagine what just social and legal systems could look like, and to ensure that rule of law is built on equality and other progressive values. The call offers the chance not only to constrain those who might abuse power, which is an important aim, but also to shape a culture of rule of law that it would improve the lives of many. I am not a lawyer, philosopher, or political theorist, and admittedly, colleagues in these disciplines have spilled the most ink over the concept of rule of law. I write about rule of law as an anthropologist who specializes in law's role in society. Feminist theory informs my approach to rule of law in many ways, but three stand out. Feminist theory takes an intersectional approach to identity and equality, and in that sense, it offers a complex way to think about equality. Equality being a key feature of rule of law, which I'll discuss in just a bit. Feminist theory also highlights voice as a route to equality. It emphasizes the importance of voice and of having a voice as a means toward equality and justice. And finally, feminist theory values compassion, especially for disempowered people. Rule of law demands the hard-nosed application of law universally and fairly to everyone, officials and non-officials alike. However, legal processes have many spaces for discretion, and compassion can play a role in those spaces. Toward the end of my paper, I'll use all three of these to explore how rule of law might be better approximated in the area of migration. Please do not be disappointed that I will refrain from directly addressing certain issues facing Maltese society and also my own society. Stating my personal views would be impolite and ill-advised, as I am a guest here and an educator, not a critic. But by focusing on the call for rule of law, my aim is to open a space for informed, constructive discussions of an important topic of our time. What is rule of law? Rule of law, according to legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron, is an essentially contested concept because so many definitions of it exist. That said, most definitions share key elements. This composite definition comes from the World Justice Project. The World Justice Project is an American-based initiative that I've been studying for about a decade. Their 4 principles are as follows. The government and its officials and agents, as well as individuals and private entities, are accountable under the law. Laws are clear, publicized, stable, and just. They're applied evenly, and they protect fundamental rights. Process is important. The process by which laws are enacted, administered, and enforced is accessible, fair, and efficient. And finally, justice is delivered in a timely way by competent, ethical, and independent representatives. Those representatives have adequate resources and reflect the makeup of the communities they serve. Here's another popular definition by Thomas Carruthers, who's written quite a bit about rule of law. The rule of law can be defined as a system in which the laws are public knowledge, are clear in meaning, and apply equally to everyone. They enshrine and uphold the political and civil liberties that have gained status as universal human rights over the last century. Now, Carruthers' definition echoes the public aspect of law and its generality in the sense of its equal application. He also mentions the shared values on which law is built, namely universal human rights. My aim is not to quibble over definitions, but it's important to know what we are calling for when we call for rule of law. For instance, rule of law is frequently conflated with law and order. Or sometimes it's willfully misunderstood in the case of political leaders who answer the public call for rule of law by threatening tough action and using iron fist policies to reduce instability. Nick Cheeseman asserts that law and order is actually the asymmetrical opposite of rule of law. Rule of law is orderly, while law and order imposes order. Law and order initiatives tend to run counter to rule of law. They harm the less powerful, they trample on individual liberty, and leave intact or worsen the situation that prompted the call for rule of law in the first place. In such circumstances, a call for rule of law answered in the wrong way could leave society worse off. My contention is that rule of law can lead to more peaceful and inclusive societies. This can be done because equality is a core value of rule of law. In Rule of Law in the Real World, Paul Gauder affirms this point, and he argues that practicing rule of law has the potential, in fact, to enhance equality. For Gauder, a baseline version of rule of law means that officials must only use their power, and officials hold incredible power, and they must only use their power according to rules that give their subjects the chance to call those users of power to account. This is not rule of man, where the whims of a leader to coerce behavior need not be explained and cannot be questioned, but rather those subject to a law can ask about it. Gauder embraces this version, but he believes it's weak. For Gauder, there's a stronger version. The rules that govern the use of coercive power must be actually justifiable to everyone on the basis of reasons that are consistent with the equality of all, end quote. Rule of law is improved when everyone feels that the laws support their own ability to question rules and reasons in equal measure compared to other people. Laws that render people unequal, even when enforced to the letter, cannot qualify as just. From a feminist perspective, Gauder's emphasis on equality is compelling. Our desire for equal treatment can justify a commitment to rule of law. Yet I want to argue from a feminist position that we can go further. Feminist theory insists that gender shapes our position, along with other aspects of identity, in ways that are inseparable and incommensurable. A working class woman and an upper class woman have qualitatively different experiences and needs. Race, age, citizenship status, religious identity, sexual preference, and other elements stand in the way of easy arguments about what women need to achieve equality. Taking an intersectional approach to identity supports social inclusivity more effectively. I'll return to this idea again. However, the main point is that equality is more complex than generally assumed, and multiple facets should be considered as we think about the notion of rule of law. Let's look at how rule of law is being used and promoted in the world today. Associated with Western democracy historically, rule of law has been exported transnationally by powerful international actors in the development arena. Promoting the rule of law has been a major aim of global financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Their development initiatives routinely include plans to enhance and promote the rule of law. They do so using a World Bank IMF framework known as the Washington Consensus, which emphasizes good business practices, open markets, and protection of property rights. Similarly, the EU and a broad range of donor nations weave rule of law into their approaches to development assistance. And rule of law is incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a sort of massive set of approaches to promote rule of law across the globe. Since the 1990s, the result is thousands of initiatives focused on law reform projects in the name of building rule of law. And the types of these projects include revising laws at the national and local levels in nations across the world, strengthening law-related institutions to make them more competent, more efficient, and more accountable, and finally, increasing the compliance of governments with law. The key approach of donors is to build a commitment to rule of law that applies from the top to the bottom of society. Ideally, rule of law culture should pervade society, and rule of law consciousness should be the end result for individuals. Another way of putting this is that emphasis on rule of law stimulates an interest in norms and encourages people to live by specific shared norms. How well has the global campaign for rule of law worked? Since 2009, the World Justice Project has published the annual Rule of Law Index, which assesses perceptions of the rule of law in 111 countries around the world. The Rule of Law Index collects the views of experts and of lay people in a methodologically sophisticated way. And it analyzes their perceptions related to 9 factors. And these are the factors that they're interested in. So these are the areas that they're looking at in relation to rule of law. They want to know what people think about constraints on government power, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, the regulatory environment, civil justice, criminal justice, and informal justice. Each of these factors that they're measuring has at least 3 sub-factors. I said it was methodologically sophisticated. Complicated might really have been the word. They each have 3 sub-factors, sometimes up to 8, and an effort is made to measure activities that have effects across sectors of society. So not just the legal system, but how does accountability work in the health area, in the education area, all the important areas of society. So this is just a small sample of the sub-factors so you can see the kinds of things they're asking people about Government officials are sanctioned for misconduct, and the respondents to their surveys answer whether this is the case, to what extent is this the case. Freedom from arbitrary interference with privacy is effectively guaranteed. From another area of measurement, due process is respected in administrative proceedings. Alternative dispute resolution is accessible, impartial, and effective. Criminal adjudication system is timely and effective. So people get a chance to comment on these aspects of rule of law in their society when questioned by the World Justice Project. So overall, each factor, each one of the 9 that I first presented, considers the timeliness, the absence of corruption, and the impartiality of the delivery of justice. So these are really key aspects of determining whether rule of law is present or not. The findings are graphed, and they're made available via the web to anyone, but they're especially interesting to companies seeking to do business in a nation, to governments trying to improve their image, and to civil society groups who want to get the facts about rule of law. This is a map of rule of law throughout the world in the 2017 measurement by the World Justice Project. You see in dark blue, primarily EU countries, Canada, Australia, especially Northern European countries. They score the highest. And the nations of the global south rank poorly, ranging through yellow, then orange, and at the bottom, red. And then there's a number of countries in gray that haven't been measured. Are you looking for Malta? It has not yet been measured. Several years back, the World Justice Project researchers told me that the EU had a great interest in measuring rule of law in all the EU nations and was willing to fund that project. Malta was slated for research. However, that's now on hold. The reasons given for the delay are, and not just Malta, but other EU countries, the reason for the delay are, number 1, Brexit, and number 2, the migration crisis. I want to speculate here that EU leadership may have realized that the migration crisis has led to lapses in rule of law that might skew that measurement. There are these are spider graphs comparing levels of rule of law in the United States with those of Kenya. I just wanted you to see what the data end up looking like. So in this kind of graph, the factors are arrayed around the circle. It's difficult to see on a slide. But countries that puff out and their lines reach almost to the edge of the circle, they're scoring high on on many of the factors. Countries that look like a spider or a tiny ball are ranking much lower. The US is high in absence of civil conflict, but low in legislative corruption and discrimination in several areas, especially criminal justice. Kenya ranks poorly, Kenya on the right, ranks poorly in corruption, protection of privacy, and violent redress outside the law. This kind of comparison influences investors to avoid certain nations and convinces some government officials to clean up their act. The WJP, the World Justice Project, provides guidance to officials in improving their country's index position and with those seeking to create access to justice for people in their nation. The Rule of Law Index has its critics. I'm sometimes one of them. As an anthropologist, I'm naturally suspicious of reducing complex social phenomena to unique measurements designed to travel globally. Methodologically, the people polled are either experts or lay people, but all of them live in cities because of the way that the study's done. A more political criticism is that this kind of measurement looks like a neo-colonial project, especially when Northern European nations end up on top. The subsequent push for rule of law reform is top-down from powerful nations to less powerful ones. It is hard not to see it as a new form of colonialism, as poorer countries are held to standards that fail to recognize the effects of their economic positioning on their ability to sustain rule of law. A related line of criticism asserts that rule of law initiatives hide their real aims, which are to support expansion of capitalism and to fulfill the Washington Consensus goals of making every country open for business. The charge is also made that rule of law promoting nations and institutions focus less than they should on controlling tyrants when these individuals have a strategic use. To the extent that rule of law approaches invest in strengthening an illiberal state, this is worrisome because the result is likely rule by law. Rule by law is the approach of legal authoritarians who use law to sustain their own power. Law-abiding and stable Singapore is actually a good example of this, and where civil liberties are kind of constrained in the vision of the state, and the way in which law is used tends to keep that state and that government in power. Rule of law promotion emphasizes technocratic solutions, while strengthening the values underlying rule of law is given less attention. If attention to core values is left aside, abuses in the name of rule of law are possible. I am skeptical of the global promotion of rule of law, given its ties to the Washington Consensus. But it is undeniable that the collapse of rule of law is terrifying. Bosnia, Rwanda, Syria, and so many other places represent catastrophic breakdowns of rule of law. Even brief lapses of rule of law are frightening. Kenya, a nation of 48 million people in East Africa, experienced a breakdown of rule of law in 2007. Generally known as politically stable and economically powerful, Kenya has a history of tumultuous presidential elections. They're full of election rigging and extreme partisanship that encourages ethnic animosity. In 2007, candidates from the ruling party and the opposition campaigned very hard and very aggressively. Even before Election Day, supporters of the incumbent had threatened violence in opposition strongholds. They used government vehicles and aircraft to create chaos so that opposition supporters were unable to vote. When the opposition candidate lost, he contested the results, and supporters on each side took to the streets. The violence left 1,000 people dead and 500,000 displaced. Much of the population lived in sheer terror for the 2 months that it took for mediators from the United Nations, the African Union, and a lot of nations around the globe to broker an agreement that ended the crisis. The electoral candidates agreed to share power, and they did so unequally as president and prime minister. And this is finally the announcement of a new cabinet. What's notable here is that the commitment to rebuild rule of law was a key component agreed to when the peace agreement was signed. So it was really foregrounded as something that Kenya needed to do. Although the ethnic politics that fueled the conflict continued, the emphasis on building and reforming rule of law was extraordinary. The centerpiece was a plan to adopt a new constitution. A 2-year deliberative process raised awareness about rule of law nationwide. Kenyans came to appreciate law's central role in their lives and adopted the Constitution in 2010. Among its notable features is the embrace of the slogan, "Unity in Diversity," which is a core Kenyan value that promotes bridging differences of ethnicity, language, religion, and gender. Support for equality and human rights is built into many articles of the 2010 Constitution. Another key component is judicial independence. The Constitution included a new process for appointing a Chief Justice through an independent Judicial Services Commission, and it eliminated the president's ability to fire the Chief Justice at will. and that had caused problems in the past. The first Chief Justice under this Constitution worked intentionally to establish rule of law through a 5-year judicial transformation framework. That framework fostered independence and transparency at all levels of the judiciary. Access to justice for people was a key concern addressed through establishing new courts, legal clinics, and opportunities for alternative dispute resolution. Let me highlight one unusual undertaking: the Kenya Judges and Magistrates Vetting Board. Before and during the 2000 election violence, some members of the judiciary were known to be partisan, corrupt, or incompetent. People had lost trust in the courts, and the violence worsened the situation. The vetting board, made up of jurists and civil society members, interviewed all judges and magistrates, everyone who was a sitting judge or magistrate, and they dismissed those who failed to show their impartiality, integrity, and competence. Kenya's rule of law reform efforts were supported by IDLO, the International Development and Law Organization, which is the only intergovernmental organization devoted exclusively to promoting the rule of law. IDLO has its headquarters in Rome, and the Italian government supports much of its work. Since the election violence of 2007, Kenya has been through 2 more presidential elections. The most recent one was in August 2017. During the campaign, Electoral Commission members were accused of partisanship and ethnic bias. Then, in a really shocking development, just before the election, the head of information technology for the election was assassinated. No one was surprised when on election day, the electronic transmission of the results was completely compromised. Not completely, actually, in certain areas was compromised. The opposition, which had lost the election, called foul. Across social media, and this was so interesting to me, across social media, messages urged people to contest the results in court, not in the streets. So there was a campaign to tell people, if you're upset, we're going to go to court. Please don't engage in violence. For me, these messages were evidence of the influence of rule of law campaigns and the way in which Kenyans themselves had taken up those campaigns as part of the Constitution process. The opposition took the case to court, and this led to the extraordinary result of Kenya's Supreme Court nullifying the presidential election. Kenyans are really proud of this rule of law triumph. There were more twists and turns before the ultimate result of the ruling party taking office again. The outcome of the election is less important than the general absence of violence and the momentous Supreme Court decision, which was the first time that an African court had nullified a presidential election. As a side note here, just a few weeks ago, Kenyans learned that Cambridge Analytica had meddled in their election using tactics similar to what had been used in the 2016 US presidential election. In both instances, people were bombarded with statements in their social media feeds that expressed partisanship and ethnic hatred. It remains to be seen if this kind of election rigging will be taken to court. Kenya's rule of law ranking improves every year, but even a strong, independent, and transparent judiciary cannot control other factors that erode rule of law. In Kenya, these include cartelism and corruption that have infiltrated the government, strained ethnic relations, increasing economic inequality, intimidation of journalists, and a painfully slow criminal investigation of the assassinated election official. However, when Kenyans are lectured by Western donors about rule of law, they now ask hard questions about whether meeting these standards is possible given global economic inequality and the deep-seated corruption of the global economic system. And lectures about rule of law ring hollow when donor countries seem to be ignoring the rule of law themselves. Looking from the global south, it's easy to become cynical about the demand for rule of law. The Kenyan example is scary. Rule of law unraveled very quickly. Yet Kenya is also inspirational because the election nullification by the court is a symbol of judicial independence that few nations have matched. Symbols of rule of law are important. Rarely are countries celebrated for their legal achievements. Malta's Gender Identity Act is known worldwide as a unique approach to equality through law. It symbolizes a commitment that many other nations have not made and recognizes the complexity of human identity. A space is opened for thinking about identity and equality in new ways. Countries can also lose their status as symbols of rule of law. Among the tragedies of the US-led war on terror was the repeated violation of rule of law standards that the United States had promoted elsewhere and had sometimes symbolized. Through torture, incommunicado detention, black sites, and states of exception like Guantanamo Bay Prison, the United States tarnished its reputation as a defender of rule of law. This issue is personal for me. I survived a terrorist bombing in 1998, and afterwards I sought justice. As a victim, I resented every suspect killed, tortured, or subjected to rendition, as that made it more difficult to prosecute those individuals using recognizable legal processes. I was grateful to witness 5 defendants held accountable in US criminal courts for the harm I had experienced. During the Obama administration, some efforts were made to resuscitate my nation's commitment to justice and human rights. But Obama's use of drones to kill suspects and other tactics of a war mentality largely failed to improve America's reputation. Let me turn to my last major section. Powerful leaders who engage in unjust behavior can erode rule of law and should be held accountable. Yet Paul Gauder, who I mentioned earlier, asserts, and I agree, lapses of rule of law in any area of the legal system can begin to undermine rule of law throughout. Support for rule of law must include attention to areas of law where people are experiencing its lack. In my nation and across Europe, lapses in rule of law in the area of migration are making our legal systems vulnerable to charges that rule of law is weakening. A recent report on migration and rule of law by the American Bar Association focuses on the 65 million people worldwide who have been forced to migrate. Displacement raises many rule of law concerns. In countries of origin, lack of rule of law is among the factors that cause people to flee. In transit countries, migrants experience arbitrary detention, criminal exploitation, and terrible rights violations. Press reporting recently has made Libya the exemplar of this horror, which puts any agreements to return migrants there at odds with rule of law. Finally, in destination countries, crises of rule of law are many, including the lack of resources to process asylum applications, international standards for protection of migrants that are ignored or unmet, slow or callous implementation of policies, people left in legal limbo, and host nation agreements that undermine the principle of non-refoulement. The recent treatment of migrants who traveled as a caravan from Central America to the United States border showed how international agreements and rule of law commitments can be blatantly ignored. When the group arrived, border agents let in only 8 people, all of whom immediately sought protection. Others were kept out with the excuse that no resources were available to process applications. How can this stance be reconciled with rule of law? They certainly knew that the caravan was coming and knew that people were seeking asylum. Systematic violation of basic commitments calls into question the legitimacy of law and undermines the system overall. Some of the problems of rule of law faced by reception nations stem from inconsistencies in refugee and asylum law and siloed approaches to policy for migrants, refugees, other displaced persons, and those policies come from the UN, the IOM, Global Compacts, other agencies. There's often mismatch and cracks that can lead to confusions and cases that never get handled. At the same time, underlying principles such as human rights and protection often fail to inform the actions of national governments and are actively opposed by extreme voices in society. So we have situations where nations abdicate responsibility for supporting international treaty obligations to protect migrants. And Hungary recently is leading the way in using law to attack NGOs who would assist those seeking care. The feminist approaches I mentioned at the outset of my talk offer some food for thought in relation to migration and rule of law. Migration poses a huge challenge to notions of equality and rule of law. If rule of law is built on the equality of non-officials and officials alike, what are the consequences of the inherent inequality of people with forms of protected status or those who lack status? How does their positioning affect other efforts to make law live up to its promise of equality? For instance, can we argue for gender equality while failing to acknowledge migrant women, some of whom are positioned so unequally and precariously that they will never benefit from the rights and protection sought? I'm not making a particular policy argument here. Instead, I'm emphasizing the importance of approaching equality through a feminist intersectional lens. One category, such as gender, can't be neatly pulled apart from other categories like race or immigration status. Without attention to those whose lives are shaped profoundly by other aspects of status, such as citizenship, we undermine the legal framework that values equality at its core. Returning to the second element of my three approaches from feminism, let me direct attention to questions of voice. How do officials and non-officials contribute to the public discussion about law as an aspect of access to justice? Here, too, many migrants have limited ability to contribute to the laws that determine their fate, whether they receive protection or not. With rule of law in mind, advocates for migrants have embraced the concept of empowered protection, which means that displaced people are provided both legal protection and also access to the knowledge and other resources to exercise their rights in practice. Ensuring everyone a voice is at the heart of this commitment. Here in Malta, several migrant committees and platforms have been convened by the government, the presidency, and other institutions to encourage voicing claims. And my understanding is that issues related to law and legal services are frequently raised. Such initiatives, pioneered by NGOs, can be very important. Empowered protection points also to the crucial role of migrant-led organizations in amplifying voices in public discourse on migration. Of course, an independent and unintimidated press is crucial for publicizing discussions that identify rule of law breaches and lapses that require attention. A feminist approach to rule of law looks at the phenomenon holistically. Law is more than a set of rules to be applied. Legal institutions and legal processes are riddled with spaces for discretion, spaces where human judgment is needed. Should this person be stopped by police? Does this behavior rise to the level of a violation? With what level of care should a displaced person be treated? Is this asylum seeker's story believable? Should these children be separated from their parents who are being detained for crossing the US border illegally? Spaces of discretion can be sites of unequal treatment and the erosion of rule of law. Yet those spaces can also be sites where values can shape decisions and where rule of law could be strengthened. In a feminist version of rule of law, spaces of discretion could be filled with when appropriate with compassion. This means considering the context and circumstances, as well as the humanity and human needs of the individual, before exercising discretion. Compassion is hardly evident right now in the United States when it comes to migration. Let's take the situation of the Dreamers. These are teenagers and young adults who were brought to the United States as children by parents who entered without proper documents. Some of them had no idea they weren't Americans until they tried to get a driving license or funding to attend university. Through a policy called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, President Obama viewed the situation as unjust and, exercising compassion, put them on a path to gaining status. Recently, President Trump has removed that protection, and the Dreamers, like their parents, are under threat of deportation. I can hardly imagine something as scary as being sent to a place of which you have no memory, and in some cases, only rudimentary cultural and linguistic skills to be able to navigate. The lack of compassion is heartbreaking. The UK took a different approach recently in showing compassion. After many decades, it provided documents to members of the Windrush generation who had also fallen through the cracks of the laws related to migration. I take some guidance here from Her Excellency, the President of Malta, who has spoken out persistently for the need for compassion in the treatment of migrants and refugees. When she refers to Malta as a caring republic, I can hear the call to fill spaces of discretion with compassion, and am convinced that rule of law is strengthened. In conclusion, the call for rule of law can be overused. If I lose a court case, I might feel unjustly treated, but rule of law is likely still intact. If I suspect that a judge has political leanings, it might not imply a breakdown of rule of law. But small and large lapses in multiple areas of a legal system add up and could signal a problem worthy of sparking the call for rule of law. And tyrants should not be tolerated. My point is that serious calls for rule of law require our attention. We have the chance to respond to these calls as opportunities to ask hard questions about leadership and rule of law, and also to strengthen the system as a whole. Today I presented examples from several parts of the world. As a legal anthropologist, I draw from across societies and cultures different from my own. This helps me to think about and examine concepts like rule of law from a variety of perspectives. My own moral imagination is invigorated by different examples, and I hope that my examples and my approaches have sparked your thinking as well. I welcome your comments and questions, and again, I really thank the President's Foundation for providing me this opportunity. Thank you. Hello.
Susan, thank you so very, very much. I think we all need to thank Professor Hirsch for a very stimulating lecture and a lot of very, very topical questions. I'm just wondering which ones to go for, although the idea of looking at discretion is always intriguing, and how far you can take that concept. Anyhow, I don't want to take up time because it's now your opportunity to make some comments or questions regarding Professor Hirsch's lecture. I would ask you please to keep your question brief and to identify yourself. There are microphones, so if you could just raise your hands, we can start off a brief Q&A because you need to be somewhere else. Okay, so at the back, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Hirsch, for a very interesting presentation. My question is...
Would you please identify yourself,
Oh,
Peter?
Peter Faruda, OPR. My question is, the rule of law is certainly different depending on what cultural context it occurs in. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the differences you've noted between the rule of law in Western democracies as opposed to in other parts of the world, and how a dialogue between those different ideas about the rule of law can help to strengthen the general way in which we approach this subject?
Do you mind? Shall we see if there are more and take 2 or 3 together? Susan, is that okay? Anyone else, please? Okay. Father Nguanes here.
Joe Nguanes. I start with a biographical note. I started studying philosophy, then theology, and sociology, and along that gamut I've turned from being an optimist to being rather cynical, in a sense. For example, when we are speaking in terms of rule of law, are we speaking of separate sovereign countries, or we've even forgotten this word, now we are speaking of jurisdictions. It's very interesting why we've changed the word, that we don't speak anymore of sovereign countries, but of different jurisdictions in terms of law. And secondly, we are speaking of international relations, for example, in terms of rule of law. Who has given the God-given right? We know who has given it, but in fact it's not God-given right for the Security Council to have 5 members who are permanent members, have to decide whether we go to war or not. And who is above them in terms of law? Is there someone above the rule of, not someone, or is it, philosophically, is there anything above the written law?
Thank you.
Anything above
The written law. Written law. Oh. Anyone else? Okay, here in the front.
Thank you so much, Professor Hirsch. I'm finding myself wondering out loud, not necessarily having an answer, but trying to sort of reflect on the difference between when the call for rule of law is top-down versus bottom-up. And I'm also thinking about the role of, ironically, the role that violence might sometimes play within this process, be it physical or symbolic and so on, and how we can sort of strive for rule of law in a way that focuses, sort of has a more peace-building focus and rings more true to the fundamental principles of rule of law in itself. Thank you.
We'll stop there and take another round if there are any more. It's okay, we'll go again. Okay, 3.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Pete's question about how rule of law looks different. I mean, it's interesting. Legal systems definitely and legal processes look really different around the world. A lot of times when people are using that phrase "rule of law," you know, they kind of have already migrated to a particular set of principles about the state and the way in which governance should be organized. So sometimes it's hard to get at what the something else is that's not that. But if I think anthropologically, and we look outside of that frame at what people are doing to order society, there are all sorts of informal legal practices and customary practices that are more flexible often than legal systems where everything is written, and they are sometimes used to strengthen the community as compared with, I mean, they're more interested in restoring communal relations rather than finding fault and holding particular individuals accountable. So rule of law and all of the ways in which it's organized doesn't deal so well with those kinds of informal and customary practices. And that's been one of the sticking points of people who are promoting rule of law worldwide. So for instance, the factors that I listed, you might have noticed that the one on the bottom was informal law. And all the things I just mentioned, like customary practices and all of that, by the people who are measuring rule of law are put in that category. And the fact of it is, they themselves have admitted they haven't done a good job measuring. And that's the only data that's not available from them. So I think we're in a situation where the frame of rule of law is actually quite different from what a lot of people are doing on the ground, particularly in places where I do research like Kenya and Tanzania. At the same time, I think there's a lot to learn from the processes that are used there, and certainly restorative justice initiatives are drawing ideas from there. Most discussions, to speak to Father Joe's question, most discussions around rule of law are really talking and thinking about sovereign states, and that's where the theory has been mostly developed. And I think you can have other, jurisdictions within those where we think about rule of law. I think things do get much more difficult to hold within that frame when you come to the international level. International law is newer, it's weaker than state law, and I think it's vulnerable to really not living up to some of the tenets of rule of law. I agree with you that it's incredibly political. The international institutions like the Security Council that have so much say over policies, political actions, and I think I'm not positioned to answer a question about higher law. I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about and debate. There's definitely a space for thinking about that in the way in which we think about values and how those inform law, how they sit in relation to written law. And finally, Sharon's question, if I got it right, I think that a lot of the ideas around effective peace building these days really do think about the need to know what people on the ground are interested in. One of the challenges is when communities have gone through significant violence, it may be a while before they're able to contribute. But I think that same logic holds for promoting rule of law initiatives or working on the legal system to get it to better approximate something that people would want to live under. That bottom-up approaches are extremely important. At the same time, I think we've lived through a time where we've seen the circulation of rights discourses across the world in ways that have been incredibly welcome by communities in many places that were not originators of those ideas. So I do think that partnerships of international organizations or donors with local are sort of the ways in which we've pursued, these kinds of initiatives have been pursued, and we're learning a lot more about how to do it in ways that are not so hegemonically top down. Rule of law isn't quite there yet, I think, because of the nature of it being rooted in legal systems and the kind of hierarchy of legal systems to start with. So there's other activities, other kinds of peace-building initiatives that have really learned the lesson of bottom-up a bit more quickly. I hope that answers.
Thank you. Are there any more? There was a lady here in the front. Would you just wait a second? Thank you. There's a microphone coming.
I don't want to take a lot of your time.
Would you identify yourself, please?
Slavica Bojanic, Sir Optimist International. When you were talking that there are some examples in some countries where the rule of law failed, you mentioned Bosnia. Can you just shortly tell us the way or how that happened in Bosnia, how the rule of law failed there?
I think that's
Okay. Are there any more? Yes, there's another question there. Thank you. I'm piecing them together.
Hello, my name is Joyce Grech. I work for the Ministry of Justice here in Malta in research. I would like to ask, you spoke a lot about public perception, especially when we looked at the World Index. How do you suggest that governments try to influence positively public perception at the grassroots, not at top level, in order to have more belief and a stronger belief in our judicial system? Thanks.
One more? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No, okay, so the last two. I have one as well, actually. Can I sneak one in? Okay. We're taking it for granted that rule of law is a good thing, and that rule of law is based within human rights principles and access to justice principles. But what happens if it's sold as not necessarily a good thing? The discretionary element that you mentioned I find particularly interesting, because the way it's interpreted is very much of the essence. And actually this ties in with the question that's come before me. I'm interested to know how you feel regarding the discretionary interpretation of rule of law and how that ties in with access to justice. I'm really interested.
Really ready to know more about what you're meaning about the discretionary interpretation of rule of law. That we might have different views of what rule of law is and what's important about it. I agree. And I think the the best contrast is sort of like the people who have been pursuing the kind of Washington consensus, and that rule of law is most important around property law and commercial law, and really being like able to use it to open markets, whereas others might really just want access to a legal system that's going to understand issues of equality and support issues of equality. And people will, kind of pool on different pieces of that. And I think it's really going to be a system that we haven't seen yet that's going to be able to handle all of those pieces. One thing about rule of law, I mean, you could look at the whole thing as a kind of ideal, that it's, the way a system should be organized, and then we often contrast it with rule of man, and women, in parentheses maybe there. But in fact, rule of law is always a system of humans making decisions. And I think that we've been a little bit fooled to think that we can that we can even imagine it as an ideal system separated from people who are making decisions on the basis of values. And maybe that allows me to speak to the second question, which is, I think some of the parts of rule of law that are really important to work through in terms of public perception are around the fundamental rights and values, because I think these are a core part of rule of law and are equally important with the notion of how the system's organized, that it's that laws should be publicized, generally applied, that sort of thing. I think if we're thinking about public projects or even educational projects in schools, I think a lot of times the fundamental rights part, or like the value that infuses a legal system gets left behind, and we talk more about the kind of bare bones, rule of law means that, everybody has to obey the law, and you often don't talk about like what's at stake in actual areas of the law. And then I think it's important to speak about the areas that people care about and that are part of their life. So I think there's a lot of different kinds of programs that can be done, and really just about, in some ways, just alerting people to what it means to have shared norms. That how commitment to certain kinds of shared norms brings us together. And then finally, I would just say that the issue of voice and access to justice is really important to alert people to, especially because we have so much cynicism about whether speaking up about what goes on in legal systems or broader political systems makes any difference. And I think people lose the sense that they can contribute to shaping what the system looks like by speaking out about it. Finally, coming from the conflict field, I know well that there are often multiple stories about what happens in situations of serious conflict, and I think I have to beg off in public speaking to that particular conflict, or probably any that had been raised at this moment. But I'd be really happy to talk to you about it. Afterwards. And I'll just say generally, in most situations of conflict, you definitely see a sort of tightening of restrictions, sometimes against particular populations, as a violation of rule of law that is something that begins to spark the conflict. You can see repressive use of law to control information, control movement of people, to control freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. These are all things that we see in terms of the development of conflict. So rule of law is for the conflict field, which I teach about, is not something we always talk about explicitly, but I think it's there as something that we probably need to pay more attention to, not just in extreme situations like that, but maybe the extreme situations kind of prompt us to start thinking about the ways in which law falls short in our everyday lives, and we aren't threatened by that kind of collapse that I've talked about today, or that we saw in places like Bosnia, but we can be challenged to think about what the improvements might do. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. There's a little something to remember us by.
Thank you so much. That's lovely.
But I think you'll all join me in thanking Professor Hirsch for some very inspiring ideas for us to continue to think about and develop. I hope that you consider coming back next year. You become a regular here, and we look forward to this exchange. And we really appreciate your sharing all these ideas and your expertise in this particular area. Rule of law is one of those things people take for granted until they actually need to use it, don't they? So it's really great. Thank you very much for joining us. There are some refreshments at the back of the room, but please join me again in thanking Professor Hirsch. Thank you.